The drumbeat for a public inquiry into murdered and missing Aboriginal women continues. Of course, it comes from the usual suspects in the media party.
The killing of Manitoba teenager Tina Fontaine has many calling for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women.
Tina Fontaine, whose death is sparking renewed calls for a national inquiry.
The discovery of the body of 15-year-old Tina Fontaine this week prompted the Canadian Human Rights Commission to add its voice to those calls.
Her death generated renewed calls for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women.
In an outpouring of anger, Tina Fontaine's death has triggered new calls for a public inquiry into the hundreds of missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls.
The murder of 15-year-old Tina Fontaine is renewing the push for a full inquiry into what's being called a national tragedy.
Look, it's expected. I mean, the media party loves the idea of theater where white lawyers and white judges will talk about how much they care for Aboriginal people, and white journalists will write about it. And everyone will look very serious and concerned and be very proud of how diverse and tolerant they are. It will take months, probably years. It will cost tens of millions of dollars and make fortunes for a great many lawyers and consultants. It will provide a spectacle for bored journalists and fodder for partisan politicians looking to blame storm. But it won't actually help a single Aboriginal woman now, will it? Because I think we need to remember what a public inquiry is. It's a kind of court that's set up for a special purpose, to inquire into a matter of public interest that can't properly be fit into another process. I mean, let me give you some examples. We had a massive failure of Canada's government-run blood banks in the 70s and 80s. The government didn't properly screen donors for diseases, so 1,000 Canadians contracted AIDS and 30,000 contracted hepatitis C, all poisoned by blood transfusions. Was it a criminal matter for the police to investigate? Well, in some cases. Was it merely a political or journalistic matter for a public debate? Well, probably more than that. So a commission of inquiry seemed to make sense, and so a retired judge named Horace Creever headed up the commission that had the power to dig into things like a policeman would, but with the main mandate to find out what was going on and make recommendations for the future. I suppose it was a good idea. It aired out the issue, but it cost millions of dollars. It took 4 full years to do. 4 years. And while it was operating, it served as a universal excuse for the government of the day to avoid questions and do nothing. Oh, it's all before the commission. I really couldn't comment. Journalists loved it because it was a circus of sorts, and a lot of big city lawyers worked so hard for it that they were rewarded by taxpayers with new cars, country homes, and fancy vacations. I mean, what a gig. A legal circus where the government pays for all the different sides in it. I mean, it's a law firm's dream. I'm not saying public inquiries are never needed. I think some of them are very much. I think the Air India Commission was an important look into Canada's worst terrorist attack. There was a criminal investigation there too, of course, but this asked additional questions. I think it was valuable. But there are a lot of commissions that are really just talk shops, a big debating society, a place where blowhards hijack the process just as a propaganda device. I'm thinking of the 1981 Kent Commission about newspapers. I mean, seriously. Why did we need a royal commission to talk about how we feel about journalists? What a joke, what a vanity project. So, of course, journalists loved it. Paul Martin called a royal commission on himself and his own party in 2004, called the Gomery Inquiry, to look at the $250 million stolen from federal government sponsorship programs, much of which was kicked back to the Liberal Party in Quebec. There was some useful information that came from that, but the police were already on the file. And it shows the risk of setting up a new creature, not quite a court, not quite a parliament, to handle something very political. Judge John Gomery, who ran the commission, he became a political figure himself, and some of his comments took on a partisan edge, which undid the court-like neutrality that was supposed to be the commission. Oh, by the way, from 1991 to 1996, we did have a 5-year Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Talk about a feast for white lawyers that was. And it was promptly put on the shelf by Jean Chrétien, the Prime Minister of the day, who proceeded to ignore it. So what about the current call for a new lawyers' feast, feasting this time on murdered and missing Aboriginal women? Well, let's quickly recap the facts. According to the RCMP, out of 6,420 missing persons in Canada, 164 are Aboriginal women, of whom 105 are missing in unknown or suspicious circumstances. 105 is a lot. But if police can't find them, how can a room full of white lawyers and activists find them? Police don't ignore missing or murdered Aboriginal women. This isn't Detroit or Chicago, where most crimes go unsolved. Here in Canada, police have solved fully 88% of murders of Aboriginal women. That's nearly identical to their solve rate for non-Aboriginal women, 89%. In the past 35 years, out of 20,313 murders in Canada, 1,017 of them were Aboriginal women. And I say again, 88% of those have been solved. So what would a new public inquiry inquire into? Who killed these women? Well, we know the answer. We charged them. Their husbands, their boyfriends, other family members, other friends. Those are the statistics behind the murders, the 88% of the murders the police solved. I told you some of the other statistics on Monday. 44% of the murderers are drunk at the time. That's triple the rate for murderers of non-Aboriginal women. So alcohol's a problem. 74% of the murderers are unemployed. Here's what makes me so mad. 71% of these murderers already had a criminal record. 53% had been convicted before of a violent crime. 62% of these murderers had a history of violence with the actual murder victim herself. You want an inquiry into the facts about these murders? You're in luck. The police already made the inquiries. Those are the facts. Alcohol abuse, social abuse, a lack of jobs, high welfare rates, but mainly that two-tier justice system I told you about that just dumps convicted Aboriginal criminals right back on the reserve with a slap on the wrist under this special Aboriginal exemption called the Gladue discount. If you're a criminal who's white or black or Chinese or whatever, you get one kind of sentence for a crime. But under Gladue, if you're an Aboriginal, you get a lower sentence. That's the law, as written by guilty white liberal judges. So our white legal system is dumping violent men right back into Indian reserves. Out of some warped attempt at kindness or diversity or some other politically correct BS, do you really think that a bunch of activist liberal lawyers in a public inquiry are going to scrutinize that? The fact that other activist liberal lawyers came up with a politically correct double standard? Of course not. You think that a bunch of rich white liberal lawyers, meticulously politically correct, exquisitely sensitive, so sophisticated and fashionable, do you think they will have the courage to talk about alcohol abuse on reserve, or joblessness, or corruption, or how the Indian industry ensures that the chiefs are rich, and the lawyers are rich, and the bureaucrats are rich, but ordinary Indians are often poor and jobless? Given the Indian industry an inquiry to look into the Indian industry's failures, that ain't going to work. I can tell you right now what they'll say after $50 million and 5 years of hand-wringing and navel-gazing. They will recommend more money for everyone, probably recommend more studies and more inquiries. I think the only thing they won't recommend are more cops, more accountability for Indian chiefs, and they certainly won't touch the Gladue discount. How do I know? Well, listen to Pam Palmater, the unofficial voice for the radical Indian industry and the favorite Indian talking head for the media party. Here, just look at a couple of clips from her on CTV recently.
What are the root causes? And we know what some of those are. The chronic underfunding, the overrepresentation in prisons and child and family services, which are caused by Harper's, federal funding issues. And what are we going to do on the policing side to make sure that this doesn't happen?
So it's a lack of government spending. That's why Aboriginal husbands kill their Aboriginal wives? Or that there's an overrepresentation of Aboriginals in prison? Is that why Aboriginals outside prison kill their girlfriends? That's what you call a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. It's not logical. It's evasion. It's someone dealing with an inconvenient fact by avoiding it. All of Pam Palmater's solutions, being mad at Whitey, demanding more money from that evil Stephen Harper, they've got nothing to do with the fact that there are deep cultural problems here that are more likely to only be fixed by local solutions, that are the responsibility of local Indian chiefs. Here, take a look at this part of her interview.
That would be true if the problem was better policing, and the problem wasn't that our kids are in foster care, we're overrepresented in prisons, there's not enough housing, and we have this increasing homelessness and all of these other social problems caused by the chronic underfunding from organizations like Indian Affairs and Health Canada. And if you really look at it in a much larger light, these are people who live within the territory of Canada, and Canada has a responsibility to protect everyone that lives in its boundaries, and it's failing to do that, and it's knowingly doing that.
Isn't that a shocker? A rich Indian industry 1%er like Pam Palmater. She's actually a six-figure earning professor who lives just outside Toronto, who only knows one solution: give more money to the Indian industry. Don't you see what this public inquiry would be about? It's not going to be about 1,000 Aboriginal women killed by members of their own communities. It's going to be about extracting more money for lobbyists and consultants and lawyers. And what a coincidence. That just happens to be Pam Palmater herself. So the solution is to reinforce failure, to continue what we've been doing that hasn't worked. Look, there is no magic solution to stopping these murders, and there's no cover-up hiding the real problem. The opposite. What we need is the slow, daily work of building normal civil society on Indian reserves. If Pam Palmater is just going to focus on funding issues, it's obvious she doesn't want to roll up her sleeves and do the real work. She's moved to the big city. She teaches rich, white, liberal kids at Ryerson University. She doesn't want to get her hands dirty actually solving local problems on reserves, actually creating jobs for unemployed men up there, actually fighting against drug and alcohol use on a reserve, actually fighting to put serial criminals behind bars instead of being sprung by liberal judges and dumped back in the reserve. Pam Palmater would rather live in the big city and make the big bucks and go on CTV and CBC and bitch about Stephen Harper. And that's why she's so loved by the media party, who inhabit that world and share her views. Now, I'm not really interested in another feast for the lawyers and activists who already know their solution means giving them more money to carp. No, I'm interested in grassroots local Indian chiefs who don't have time to go on TV. They're too busy building their communities. I'm pretty sure a public inquiry won't be featuring a lot of them.